Hello students, welcome to lecture 7. Today we're going to be discussing the digestive system. The digestive system is discussed in more detail in chapter 34 in your textbook. So the digestive system, of course, is how we gain energy from the catabolism of food, right? So we learned that anabolism is the building of human tissues in the human body, building of tissues of the body, whereas catabolism is where you take the tissues from a plant or from another animal, you eat them and you digest them, and then you extract the energy from the taking apart of those molecules and those tissues. Okay, and then we use that to power our own systems. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we're going to begin by having a tour of the human digestive system and all the organs that are in the human digestive system, including the oral cavity, which is the space, basically the mouth, the oral cavity, the esophagus, which is the tube that leads from the mouth to the stomach, and then the stomach, which is where protein digestion begins, then the intestines, and then the colon and the rectum, which is where the food that our digestive system is unable to digest leaves the body as waste, as excrement. Then we'll have a brief discussion about nutrition. In other words, what do you need to eat in order to maintain a healthy body? We've already briefly discussed in lecture 3 what essential amino acids and essential fatty acids are. The essential amino acids, there are 20 amino acids, 20 different types of amino acids. We need lots of each of those 20 different types of amino acids. It just so happens that we have lost the ability to make all 20 of them, and so therefore we must get them in our diet. There are many primitive organisms, primitive life forms on Earth that can still make all 20 of the amino acids. Most bacteria can. Most yeast, which are a type of fungus, most yeast cells can make all 20 of the amino acids. So you know, you might have heard of this disgusting food called Marmite, which they sell in Australia, which is really just extracted yeast cells. So they take yeast cells and grind them down and make them into a paste, which you can spread on your toast, and it tastes horrible to my tastes. It tastes awful, but it is very nutritious because it contains all of the essential amino acids, contains all ample quantities of all the 20 amino acids. Okay, the essential fatty acids, mainly we generally get those in oils, vegetable oils or fish oils, which is a very rich source of the essential fatty acids. And finally, the essential vitamins. What are vitamins? Vitamins are what are known as cofactors for enzymes. So you already know what enzymes are. And the enzymes are made of protein, but they can't function with just the protein part. Usually there's an accessory piece, another piece that must fit into the enzyme, and it is usually a complicated chemical structure. And those complicated chemical structures that are cofactors for enzymes are what we call vitamins. So there are vitamins that we need. If we didn't get the essential vitamins that we need in our diet, our enzymes would not be able to do their jobs properly, because the various different enzymes require the addition of various different cofactors that we have lost the ability to make, and so we have to get them in our diet as well. And then we're just going to have a discussion. We'll deviate from human biology for a minute to discuss the different variations of the animal digestive system that you see. So humans are mammals. There are many mammals that eat meat, and there are many animals that eat vegetables and leaves and green things, and there are many animals that eat both. And so the animals that eat just meat are called carnivores. The animals that just eat vegetables and leaves and grass are called herbivores, and the animals that eat both are called omnivores. And as it happens, those animals eat those things because their digestive system is particularly suited for eating those things rather than other things. So generally, if herbivores try to eat meat, they can't really digest it. They can't really chew it or digest it. The reverse is true for carnivores. They prefer not to eat vegetables. Some of them can survive if they do, but they generally don't. And then omnivores will eat anything. And so we will look at some of the key features, some of the main ways in which the digestive systems of carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores differ, which is quite interesting because the carnivores, the herbivores, and the omnivores are all mammals, just like humans. So we're all very similar. So these differences that in the digestive systems that classify us as either being a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore are subtle. These are minor differences, but significant differences that are significant enough that they cause us to eat one type of food versus the other. And then we're going to finish the lecture by touching on a subject called odontology. Odontology is the study of teeth. And there are people who devote their entire lives, believe it or not, to the study of teeth. But we're just going to talk about the very simplest things to do with odontology, namely the classification of teeth. We've touched on this briefly when we started talking about the skull and the teeth within the skull in lecture 6. So we mentioned the fact that in the front of the mouth, most mammals have in the front of their mouth, they have incisor teeth, and then if you move a little bit back in the mouth, you have canine teeth, and then at the very back of the mouth, the posterior side of the mouth, we have the molars. The incisors are meant to bite off pieces of food that we then chew up. The canine teeth are meant mainly for killing. It's a characteristic of carnivores. And the molars are made for grinding things up. So, for example, carnivores have enlarged canines. They have very big fangs, and herbivores tend to have very small fangs or very small canine teeth, or the canine teeth are absent altogether, but they have enlarged, large, rough molars because they chew up leaves which they need to grind up, and so they have very developed, specialized molar teeth. All right, let's begin with a tour of the human digestive system. All right, so the entire digestive system from the mouth all the way through to the anus is collectively referred to as the alimentary canal. It is referred to as the alimentary canal. Right, now, if you just look at the mouth part, that of course is called the oral cavity. The oral cavity. There is a little flap of tissue that connects the oral cavity to the esophagus, and that is called the epiglottis. Now, the reason we have an epiglottis, which is a little flap of tissue that closes when we swallow, is because the mouth opens onto both the esophagus and the trachea. The esophagus is the tube that joins the mouth to the stomach. Right? It joins the mouth to the stomach. Now, the mouth opens on both the esophagus as well as the trachea. The trachea is the tube that carries air to the lungs. So the epiglottis is there in order to prevent food from going into your lungs instead of into your esophagus. So when you swallow, that's something happens that is referred to as the swallow reflex. The swallow reflex is that when you swallow food or liquid, the epiglottis will close off the top of the trachea and allow the food to go down the esophagus. So that's why you notice that you can't breathe when you're swallowing. You can't inhale when you're swallowing because the epiglottis has closed off the top of the trachea. The trachea is commonly called the windpipe. So during the swallow reflex, you chew up food and then you swallow it, and when you swallow it, you can literally, if you pay attention, you can literally feel the epiglottis closing in the back of your throat. And what it is it's a flap of tissue that closes like a lid. It closes the lid on the windpipe, on the trachea, so that food or liquid does not go into your lungs when you're eating. Okay, there's some animals that don't have to worry about that because the trachea goes directly to the nose where they breathe, and the esophagus goes directly to the mouth, and so the oral cavity does not. In some animals, the oral cavity does not actually is not actually connected to the trachea, to the windpipe. All right, so we have the esophagus, which connects the oral cavity to the stomach. Notice that there's an organ here called the liver that's in front of the windpipe as you get closer to the stomach. Right, so the stomach is where digestion of proteins begins with a special enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin is what's known as a protease enzyme because it breaks down proteins. And it does so. It has an optimum pH of 2, which means that it breaks down proteins best in an acidic environment. The pH of the stomach is 2.0. It's very acidic because there are cells in the stomach that can produce hydrochloric acid, concentrated hydrochloric acid. So the stomach is a low pH acidic environment. There is an enzyme in the stomach called pepsin, which will break down or hydrolyze proteins at a low pH. Then, so digestion, and specifically pepsin, it digests proteins. It does not digest carbohydrates or anything else. I should mention the fact that in the oral cavity in the mouth, we have these things up here that are called the salivary glands. Right? You know what saliva is. The common term is just spit, saliva, and it is actually a fluid that's produced by some specialized glands in the mouth called the salivary glands. So you can see the salivary glands up here. Now the salivary glands, saliva is a mixture of water, salt, and proteins, and some of those proteins are amylases. Do you remember what amylases do? Amylases digest amylose, which is commonly called starch, which is the main energy storage material that you would find in plants. And so therefore, digestion of starch begins in the mouth, not in the stomach. So there's a little bit of digestion of as the food is being chewed up in the mouth, a little bit of digestion of starch begins in the mouth. And as the food, digestion of starch continues as the food travels down to the stomach. Now, once the food gets into the stomach, digestion of the starch may slow down or stop for two reasons. One is that the pH is too low. So the optimum pH of salivary amylase enzymes, the amylase enzymes that are produced in saliva, the optimum pH is around 7.2 or something like that. So you can see that once these enzymes get into the stomach where the pH is 2, digestion of carbohydrates, starches, will generally stop. And there's another problem as well, which is that the salivary amylase enzymes are made of protein, and in the stomach we have an enzyme called pepsin whose job it is to hydrolyze protein as if it were food. Right, so the amylase enzymes, the salivary amylase enzymes have a short chance, a very brief period of time, to begin digestion of starch, which begins in the mouth. And so the longer you chew the food, the more chance those amylase enzymes have to start breaking down the starch. As the food is traveling down the esophagus, the digestion of starch continues, and then when it enters the stomach, it generally stops. Now the food then is the proteins. Digestion of proteins begins in a very large way in the stomach with the mixture of hydrochloric acid and pepsin to the food. So protein digestion begins there. And then the food leaves the stomach and goes into the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine, which is located over here, is called the duodenum. The duodenum is a very special part of the small intestine. The small intestine is actually divided into three parts called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the duodenum is a special part because what happens is in the stomach we have pH 2, and in the rest of the intestine we have pH 7.5 to 8, pH 7.5 or 8. So we say that the stomach is an acidic environment, and the intestine is an alkaline environment. It's a basic environment. So the pH has to suddenly go all the way from 2 all the way up to 8 inside the duodenum. And how this is accomplished is that there's another organ that's located behind the stomach, which is called the pancreas. The pancreas produces, among other things, the pancreas produces bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a chemical that happens to have a very high pH. So the cells of the pancreas produce bicarbonate. That bicarbonate is pumped into the duodenum so that as soon as food enters the duodenum, the pH goes up very, very quickly from goes all the way from pH 2 all the way up to pH 8, so that the enzymes that are added to the food in the intestine can continue to work. Now the pancreas also produces a whole bunch of enzymes that will digest proteins and carbohydrates and lipids as well. Right, so the pancreas, in addition to bicarbonate, the pancreas produces digestive enzymes that can break down proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So the pancreas also produces proteases, polysaccharidases, and lipases. And all of the enzymes that are produced by the pancreas have their optimum pH at pH 7.5 or 8, which means that they work best in an alkaline environment like the small intestine. Okay, so that is what the pancreas does. There's another function of the pancreas that is part of the endocrine system, and we'll talk about it later. So the pancreas produces some hormones as well, which we will talk about during our discussion of the endocrine system later in the course. Okay, so we have the stomach, which we've discussed, and then food leaves the stomach and enters the duodenum. In the duodenum, more enzymes and bicarbonate are added to the food, and those enzymes continue to break down the food slowly as it travels through the small intestine. The small intestine is divided into 3 parts. The first part that the food enters is called the duodenum. The second part is called the jejunum. Jejunum is up here. The ileum is farther down, and then the ileum is the spot where the small intestine makes contact with the large intestine, which is this part here, this rough part that looks like a vacuum cleaner hose. And the spot where the small intestine meets the large intestine, this kind of bulgy part right here at the base of the large intestine, is referred to as the cecum. Right, so the cecum is the spot where the small intestine joins the large intestine. I won't ask you about this in this course, but there's a valve there that controls how fast the food moves from the small intestine into the large intestine. That valve is called the ileocecal valve because it is a border between the ileum and the cecum, so it's called the ileocecal valve. Okay, now the large intestine is sometimes referred to as the colon, is actually divided into 3 parts as well, and I probably won't ask you about this in this course, but the 3 parts are, as you go, the food travels down the small intestine, enters the cecum. Notice, by the way, that attached to the cecum we have the appendix. The human appendix used to be it's what they call a vestigial part of the immune system. The word vestigial means that in biology, the word when you talk about a vestigial organ, it means that it's an organ that no longer serves the purpose that it originally did. So in more primitive animals and more primitive mammals, the appendix is actually part of the immune system. But in humans, human evolution has kind of gone in a direction where we didn't use it anymore, and so it's kind of in the process of disappearing. Right, so the appendix is a vestigial organ that's a vestigial part of the immune system. In biology, the term vestigial organs is very important because when people who discuss evolution, they talk about a lot of animals and the various vestigial organs that they have that they presumably used at one point but no longer do. For example, if you cut the skin and the meat away from a snake, you'll see that the snake has shoulder blades. The snake has a couple of scapula. But the shoulder blades are not being used for the pectoral girdle in a snake because a snake doesn't have any arms. And so we say that the snake has vestigial shoulder blades. The snake has vestigial scapulae. Because it no longer has arms. So we think that a snake at one time had arms, and throughout the course of evolution, the snake lost its arms. And then if you look at the ventral fins of a whale, they look just like the fins of a shark. But if you look at the bones inside the whale fins, a whale is a mammal, you see that it has phalanxes, it has phalanges, so it has fingers, but the fingers have all fused together, so that a whale, we believe that whales are mammals. At one point in history, they had four fingers, and they lived on land, and then they went back to the ocean, and they adopted to living in the ocean. And one of the adaptations that they went through was that you know, what does a whale need hands for? It's better served by having the fingers fused together so that it can use the ventral fins as to swim, right? So a whale has vestigial fingers inside its ventral fins. Okay, so there are a lot of ventral organs, vestigial organs in the bodies of various types of animals. So in humans, the appendix is one example of a vestigial organ. So I could possibly ask you on a test, give me one example of a human vestigial organ, and the human most obvious example is the appendix. It's not needed, it doesn't do anything useful anymore, and in fact it's prone to getting infected and then maybe bursting, or getting irritated and swollen, in which case that's called an appendicitis. So appendicitis is irritation and inflammation of the appendix, and often they just take the appendix out. Okay, because it's not doing anything. So why we don't, if it becomes irritated and becomes problematic, we just remove it because we don't believe it does anything. Okay, so down here, the cecum, the appendix is attached to the cecum. The cecum is the bulgy part of the large intestine where the large intestine makes contact with the small intestine, specifically the part of the small intestine called the ileum. And then going up this way, the food rises. Therefore, this is called the ascending colon. Then the food makes a sharp turn to the left and travels this way, and therefore this is called the transverse colon. The transverse means to go across. And then down on the left side of the body we have the descending colon because the food is headed back down again. And then this bottom part of the colon is shaped sort of like the letter S, and so the letter S in Greek is called sigma. We therefore call this part of the colon the sigmoid colon. And then the anus is where the food leaves. The rectum is where the food is, the last stop for the food before it leaves through the hole called the anus. And so that not all of the food that we eat can be digested, and so anything that's left over that we can't eat, we get rid of. By that time, you may know this, but the word symbiotic means two organisms living in very close proximity to each other, benefiting from each other's existence, and one of those organisms may actually live inside the other. And so our intestines are filled with symbiotic bacteria, especially the colon. The small intestine, not really, but the large intestine is filled with billions of bacteria. Some of them are E. coli, Escherichia coli. Some of them are Lactobacillus acidophilus. All these different names of the bacteria that live in our colon. And it's a symbiotic relationship because we provide those bacteria with an ample supply of food, don't we? So some of the food, as it passes through our colon, some of the food that we've eaten is then consumed and absorbed by these symbiotic bacteria that are in our intestine. And so we provide them with food and a nice, warm, comfortable place to live. They provide us with vitamin K. Right, so vitamin K is one of the essential vitamins that we'll talk about later. Humans do not produce enough vitamin K, but Escherichia coli, which is a bacteria, produces lots of spare vitamin K, which we then absorb. Right, so it's a symbiotic relationship. The Escherichia coli, the E. coli, is a bacteria that lives in our colon. We give them food, they give us vitamin K. All right, now as I said, this entire system is considered to be a single tube that runs from the mouth all the way to the rectum, and it is referred to as the alimentary canal. And then attached to the alimentary canal, we have what are known as accessory organs. Accessories, you know what accessories are. Like if a woman wears clothes, a handbag is considered to be an accessory. You know, something else that you add on to make things even better, right? So the accessory organs that are attached to the alimentary canal are the liver and the gallbladder, which is this green thing located behind the liver. It's located posterior to the liver. All right, now the liver produces, in this case, the liver actually is a very fascinating organ. It does a lot of things in anatomy. Unfortunately, just like in real life, the fancy, flashy, show-off organs like the heart and the brain get all the publicity, whereas hard-working, humble organs like the liver do all the work and they get very little credit. In fact, the liver does about a dozen different things that are all important. And one of the things that happens in the liver is that the liver produces a fluid, a thick fluid called bile, B-I-L-E, bile, which is green in color. You might have heard the term bilious. The term bilious means kind of a brownish green color, bilious green, and it is that color is the color of bile. So bile is an ugly greenish liquid. Now the bile is produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder. That's why the gallbladder appears greenish, kind of a sickly green if you look at it. And the gallbladder stores bile and sends it to the duodenum when needed. Okay, so when does it need it? When food is passing through the duodenum. Now bile, in fact, what's stored in the gallbladder is actually referred to as bile salts. And what happens when you mix an oil with a salt? What happens if you mix an oil or a fat with a salty water solution? You will see that that's exactly what happens in your bottle of salad dressing. You have this bottle of salad dressing, and the oil is usually either floating on top or at the bottom, depending on which type of oil it is. And then you have a salty water solution. What happens when you want to put that salad dressing, that salad oil on your salad? You have to shake up the bottle. And when you shake up the bottle, the oil breaks up into a bunch of very small droplets. So when that happens, that is referred to as emulsification. Emulsification. So the purpose of bile salts that are delivered to the duodenum when food goes through, the purpose of those bile salts is it's a salty liquid, a green salty liquid whose purpose is to emulsify any oils or fats that are entering our digestive system. And then remember that our pancreas has produced lipases that it puts into the duodenum, whose job it is to digest and break down fats and oils. So the job of breaking anything down is much easier if it's in small pieces, because remember that enzymes work from the surface inwards, right? So if you take if you take a piece of wood and you try to set fire to it, it will not catch fire as fast as if you grind that wood up into wood chips or sawdust. Right? So you know that if you try to light sawdust on fire, it will practically explode, because it has more surface area to catch fire. Right? So wood burns from the surface area inward, and digestion of food begins from the enzymes that digest food do it from the outside in. If you break food into smaller pieces, the enzymes have more surface area to begin working. So that is one of the reasons why we chew up our food in our mouth, because we're breaking the food up into smaller pieces and we're mixing it with salivary amylase enzymes, and then we swallow it, and then it gets into the stomach, and then these small pieces are coated with pepsin, which digests the protein. Then it moves into the duodenum. There are more lipases and amylases and polysaccharidases and proteases in the duodenum that have been produced and put there by the pancreas. And then the function of the bile salts, which are sent to the duodenum by the gallbladder, their job is to break the fats and the oils up into very small droplets. That process is called emulsification. And then the lipases that have been produced by the pancreas can get to work digesting the lipids. Okay, so all of that happens in the duodenum, which is why the duodenum is a very special part of the small intestine. The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine that's connected to the stomach. Food leaves the stomach and then enters the duodenum, and where the food is then mixed with bicarbonate, lipases, proteases, amylases, and bile salts. Okay, now notice that at the top of the esophagus, which is the tube that leads from the mouth to the stomach, you can't really see it in this diagram, but there's a little thing called the esophageal sphincter. Right, so a sphincter is a ring of muscles that can contract to close off a tube. Right, so at the top of the esophagus we have the esophageal sphincter, so that when you swallow your food, when the food is going from your mouth into the esophagus, the esophageal sphincter has to open in order to let the food enter your esophagus. Once the food has gone into your esophagus, the esophageal sphincter closes again so that nothing else can come in behind it, and also more importantly so that the food can't come back the other way, as if you were vomiting. The food cannot travel back and come back out of the esophagus again. All right, so the food goes down the esophagus through a type of motion that is referred to as peristalsis. Peristalsis is the way that the alimentary canal moves food through this long tube, and I'll explain what peristalsis is in a minute. All right, so at the top of the esophagus we have the esophageal sphincter, and then at the bottom of the esophagus and at the top of the stomach, which would be right here in this diagram of the stomach, we have another sphincter which is called the cardiac sphincter. The cardiac sphincter. So this is the one case in human anatomy where the word cardiac does not refer to the heart. So in this case, the cardiac sphincter is the sphincter that controls how fast food goes from the bottom of the esophagus into the top of the stomach. Okay, so then the food remains in the stomach for a little while, and then it leaves the stomach into the duodenum. But the rate at which the food moves from the stomach into the duodenum is controlled by another sphincter, which is right here, and that other sphincter is called the pyloric sphincter. The bottom part of the stomach is referred to as the pylorus, and therefore the sphincter that controls the entry of the movement of the food from the pylorus into the duodenum is called the pyloric sphincter. Okay, so starting with the oral cavity up at the top of the alimentary canal. So we have the oral cavity, which is the mouth, contains the cavity, the mouth, and the teeth, and the tongue. The purpose of the tongue, as I said before, originally the purpose of tongue in mammals, the purpose of the tongue was to reposition the food over the teeth as you're chewing it up. So you reposition the food. Now humans have evolved another purpose for the tongue, which is speech, which is very handy for us as a means of communication. Okay, as I said, the mouth contains several glands. By the way, a gland is an organ that produces something and secretes it outside to the outside world. Secretion means to send to the outside world. Okay, so a gland is something that produces something and then kind of squirts it out into the outside world. It either goes out into the blood or it goes out into other parts of the body. So in this case, we have the salivary glands that produce saliva. Saliva is a mixture of salty water and proteins, and many of those proteins are amylase enzymes. So we call those salivary amylases. And so the breakdown of starch or amylose begins in the mouth. When you chew the food up and mix it with saliva, it becomes a ball of food that is referred to as a bolus, right? So you know that when you swallow the food, it doesn't go down continuously. It goes down in these little ball shapes that you've chewed up into a ball shape, and then it rolls down. It kind of gets sent down the esophagus by peristalsis. Right, so that is a bolus. I could ask you what a bolus is on a test. Now we have the epiglottis, which is the flap of tissue that closes off the top of the trachea like a lid, and so it prevents the food from going into your lungs instead of into your stomach. And then at the top of the esophagus, we have the esophageal sphincter. It closes off the top of the esophagus. So the esophageal sphincter must open in order to let the food go through. And then it closes after the bolus has gone by. Right, so remember that a sphincter is a ring of muscle that closes off the top of a tube. So here we have the oral cavity, so you can see the teeth, and then at the back of the mouth, sort of almost just below the ear, one of the salivary glands is referred to as the parotid gland. I will not ask you that specifically. And then there's another one located right under the tongue. Right, well, it's actually located at the bottom of the jaw, and it's called the submandibular gland. Do you remember what the jawbone was called from lecture 6? The jawbone was called the mandible, right? So the word submandibular means underneath the mandible. And then there's another one that is actually located right under the tongue. So the salivary gland located right under the tongue is called the sublingual gland. So we have these three glands, and then we have three of them on each side. So in total, there are 6 salivary glands. I could ask you how many salivary glands there are. I might ask you to name one. Can you name any salivary glands? All right, so when we chew up our food, it becomes a bolus, right? And then we're going to swallow it. We're going to send it down the esophagus, but we have to make sure that it doesn't go this way instead. This is the trachea, which leads to the lungs. Trachea, commonly known as the windpipe. The way to avoid that is to have the epiglottis. The epiglottis is this flap of tissue right here. You can see it, right? So this flap of tissue is open right now. If we're going to swallow, we have to close it so that we close off this part of the trachea, ensuring that the food goes down the esophagus instead. When this happens, this is referred to as the swallow reflex, right? So what happens during the swallow reflex? You swallow the food, the epiglottis closes the top of the trachea, the food travels by, the esophageal sphincter opens, lets the food travel by, the esophageal sphincter closes to prevent the food from coming back up, and then the epiglottis opens again. Those motions altogether are referred to as the swallow reflex. So I could ask you to tell me what happens during the swallow reflex. Okay, so the esophagus is the tube that leads from the mouth to the stomach. There is an esophageal sphincter at the top of the esophagus. Then at the bottom of the esophagus, just above the stomach, there's another sphincter called the cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter is the only time that you will hear something other than the heart referred to with the word cardiac rather. Okay, so another term for the cardiac sphincter is also called the gastroesophageal sphincter, because the word gastro, the prefix gastro, refers specifically to the stomach, right? So a gastric ulcer, for instance, is a hole in the stomach. Okay, so the purpose of the gastroesophageal sphincter, the purpose of the cardiac sphincter, is to close off the top of the stomach and prevent a specific condition called acid reflux. If any of you have taken chemistry, you know that when you do refluxing in chemistry, that's where you boil some liquid in a flask and it bubbles up into a tube above the flask, right? So a liquid is pushed up into a tube above the flask where the liquid is contained. Okay, so reflux. So in the case of acid reflux, what happens in the case of acid reflux is your cardiac sphincter doesn't work properly, and the stomach is lined with a layer of mucus. You know what mucus is? Mucus is the runny stuff that comes out of your nose when you catch a cold, right? So there are many places in the body that produce mucus, and they are called mucous membranes. So the inside of the stomach is a mucous membrane that produces a lot of mucus. It produces so much mucus that it actually protects the inside of the stomach from being burned by the hydrochloric acid that the stomach produces, right? The esophagus doesn't have that. So if you send hydrochloric acid from the stomach up into the esophagus, it literally burns because it's an acid. The liquid in the stomach is hydrochloric acid. If you poured hydrochloric acid down your throat, it would certainly hurt, wouldn't it? It would be excruciatingly painful. And so that is exactly what happens if the cardiac sphincter doesn't work to contain the stomach acid, so that the hydrochloric acid bubbles, refluxes up into the esophagus, causing a burning pain. Right, so the main purpose of the gastroesophageal sphincter, the main purpose of the cardiac sphincter, is to close off the top of the stomach and prevent acid from the stomach from bubbling up into the esophagus and causing pain. Okay, now the entire alimentary canal is lined with columnar epithelium. If I hadn't mentioned that before, you should know that. The entire alimentary canal is lined with columnar epithelium. So the the esophagus is lined with columnar epithelium, so is the stomach, so is the intestine, so is the small and the large intestine. All right, so as it happens, the columnar epithelium that forms the inside of the stomach also contains specialized cells that produce a lot of mucus, whose job it is to protect the stomach from getting burned by its own acids. Right, so the columnar epithelium is a form of epithelium, right? And then that's what lines the inside of the stomach. And then we have smooth muscle on lining the outside of the stomach, as well as the outside of the esophagus and the outside of the intestines. Right, now, these layers of smooth muscle provide a form of movement called peristalsis. So peristalsis is where you squeeze the food through this long tube by pinching the area behind the food shut, thus pushing it forward, right? So if you have food traveling through a tube, as the food passes by, you contract the muscles on the outside of the tube, pushing the food forward. The food moves forward a little bit, and then you squeeze the muscles behind it and move it forward some more. Okay, so the entire alimentary canal sends food through peristalsis. We have the cardiac sphincter, also known as the gastroesophageal sphincter, here at the top of the stomach, preventing stomach juices from going up into preventing specifically the hydrochloric acid from going up into the esophagus and causing pain as well as damage. If you have constant acid reflux, it does cause damage to the esophagus. And then at the bottom of the stomach, the pyloric section of the stomach, we have the pyloric sphincter, whose job it is to control the rate at which food moves from the stomach into the duodenum. And the food is propelled through the entire alimentary canal using peristalsis. So in peristalsis, here we have the bolus, and we squeeze the smooth muscles shut above it. That causes the bolus to move downwards a bit. Right? And then you squeeze again right behind it. That causes the food to move downward, and then you squeeze behind it. Right? So that is called peristalsis. You may have heard of something called a peristaltic pump. A peristaltic pump is a human invention. It's a machine that pumps fluids through hoses by basically doing the same thing. It rolls. They have have you seen a rolling pin that people use to roll dough? You know, if you roll this rolling pin over the hose, it forces liquid to go through the hose, and that's what a peristaltic pump is. For example, if you're in a hospital and you have an IV, an intravenous tube, the fluid is being pumped into your veins using a peristaltic pump. The peristaltic pump rolls a roller over the thin plastic tube to push liquid through it. So it's the same idea. This is called peristalsis, which is a word you need to know. Okay, within the stomach we have a lining of specialized columnar epithelial cells that produce both hydrochloric acid to lower the pH and an enzyme called pepsin. The hydrochloric acid and the pepsin together are referred to as gastric juice. Okay, you need to know these terms. Okay, so the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin together that you find in the stomach is called gastric juice. If you add food to gastric juice, remember when the food was traveling from the mouth down the esophagus, we called it a bolus. As soon as the bolus enters the stomach and mixes with the gastric juice, it's no longer called a bolus. We refer to it as chyme. Not chime, but chyme. I mentioned before many times that biology is filled with Latin words. And in Latin, the language spoken by the Romans, they did not have a soft CH sound, right? So, you know, Julius Caesar, that's an anglicized version of Julius Caesar's name. The Romans actually didn't have a J, so his actual name was Iulius. First name was Iulius, and they didn't have a soft C as in Caesar. His last name, family name, was actually pronounced Kaiser. So generally in Latin, you pronounce a hard C rather than a soft C. However, you know, if enough people are doing it wrong, it becomes an accepted thing to do. That's unfortunately, you know, that's something that drives teachers crazy sometimes. That if enough people say something the wrong way, it becomes acceptable, and the battle is lost, basically. So the battle has been lost over the hard C in Latin for a lot of words. For example, we say the word cinema. It should actually be pronounced kinema, but if you were speaking real Latin, but never mind, enough people say cinema that we give up and say that's fine, whatever. But at the moment, the word chyme has not surrendered, right, to modern English. Right, so chyme is a Latin word, and it is pronounced with a hard C. Right, so chyme, chyme, is the what you call food when it enters the stomach. Okay, so pepsin is the enzyme produced in the stomach which hydrolyzes the peptide bonds. Remember when we talked about the macromolecules, we said that the covalent bonds between two amino acids have a special name. We call a covalent bond between two amino acids a peptide bond, and the enzyme that hydrolyzes or breaks apart peptide bonds using water is called pepsin. So the word pepsin comes from peptide because pepsin breaks all of the peptide bonds regardless of where they are. You do not need to know this for this course, but later on in the intestine, you have a bunch of other proteases that will not digest, they will not hydrolyze every peptide bond. They'll only hydrolyze peptide bonds that are found between certain combinations of amino acids. Okay, so anyway, pepsin will digest any of the peptide bonds, and it works best at pH 2. It has an optimum pH of pH 2. And the columnar epithelium that lines the stomach produces a thick layer of mucus to protect the stomach from being burned by its own acid and being digested by its own protease enzymes. Okay, so here we have a close-up inside the stomach. This is actually a scanning electron microscope image of what's known as a gastric pit. So a gastric pit is a little indentation in the stomach where you have this big indentation that's lined with columnar epithelium. Now, some of those columnar epithelium are called parietal cells. Parietal cells are the cells that produce the hydrochloric acid. And then there's another type of cell lining the gastric pit called a chief cell. And the chief cell produces an enzyme called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is the inactive precursor for pepsin. In other words, it's a long enzyme that's made out of multiple repeating units of pepsin. As long as they're hooked together in a chain, they are inactive. How do you activate them? You break them apart into individual pepsin monomers. And what is it that breaks it apart? Pepsin, right? So you have to have a little bit of pepsin left over in your stomach from your last meal in order to activate the pepsinogen that appears when you eat your next meal, right? So it's kind of like pepsin breaks down pepsinogen into pepsin, and then you leave some of the pepsin around to break down pepsinogen, start the chain reaction with pepsinogen creation next time around. All right, so you can see that the inside of the stomach is kind of bumpy. That's because it's kind of contracted. Those are called rugae. I won't ask you about that. And then we have the cardiac sphincter and the pyloric sphincter, which control entry of food into the stomach versus out of the stomach. As soon as you mix the bolus of food with the gastric juices, we rename it chyme. Okay, then the stuff that leaves the stomach and goes into the duodenum is still chyme, and then we raise the pH rapidly in the duodenum, which is shown here, right? Which rapidly in the duodenum, and then we add a whole bunch of other enzymes that continue to break down the food as it travels through the intestine. All right, now we're not talking about the endocrine system yet, but you need to know the names of two hormones that kind of mediate and control the digestive process. First of all, there's a hormone that's called gastrin, and gastrin is a hormone that's produced by the stomach itself. And as soon as proteins enter the stomach will secrete or send out the hormone gastrin, which tells all the cells in the stomach to start producing. It causes the release of gastrin, which causes the stomach to start producing HCl, the hydrochloric acid. Right. So sometimes production of HCl in the stomach can also be triggered by caffeine. Caffeine is found in large amounts in coffee, which is the reason why it's good to drink coffee after a meal, because it helps your stomach, it encourages your stomach to produce HCl. But it's bad to drink coffee the rest of the time because it's causing your stomach to produce acid when there's no food in there, and so that can lead to ulcers, right? So drinking coffee other than at mealtime, like I do, I basically drink coffee all day long. I can't do anything else because I'm addicted to it, like a lot of people. So I drink coffee all day long, and as a result of that, I sometimes suffer from acid reflux. In particular, you should particularly avoid drinking coffee before bedtime because that puts a lot of acid in your stomach, and when you lay down flat, the acid can more easily the acid in the stomach that's produced due to the coffee doesn't have to travel upwards against gravity to get into the esophagus, because the esophagus is now on the same level as the stomach, and it can more easily get into the esophagus. So people who drink coffee before bedtime can often suffer from acid reflux. Acid reflux is commonly called heartburn because it feels like the area near your heart is burning. In fact, what's happening is that the bottom part of the esophagus is being splashed with acid and giving the burning sensation. The other thing that you should avoid doing is eating meals before going to bed, because then your stomach makes acid and pepsin to digest the food, and then again you're going to lay down flat, and it's easier for the gastric juices to come out of the stomach into the esophagus because they no longer have to go upwards against gravity. Right, so two easy ways to avoid acid reflux are to not drink coffee too late in the evening and to not eat any meals late in the evening. In fact, because your stomach gets into the habit of producing gastrin and another protein called somatostatin, these two enzymes together control basically turning the stomach on and turning the stomach off. If you have regular meal times, like you always eat breakfast at a certain time, you always eat lunch at a certain time, you always eat dinner at a certain time, and you do not snack on foods outside of those times, then your stomach will have a very controlled production of these enzymes, of these hormones rather, and you will not, if you make it a habit not to eat after dinner, not to do midnight snacking or anything like that, then you will no longer feel hungry at these times. In fact, the only times during the day that you will actually feel hungry is right before mealtime, because your body has been trained, your endocrine system has been trained to produce these enzymes just during meal times. And your body gets to accept the fact that you're going to eat at an exact time every day, and you don't feel hungry any other time. So that's quite handy. That's actually a very good thing. So, for a healthy lifestyle, to avoid acid reflux, to avoid overeating because you feel hungry all the time, a very good way to do that is simply to have regular meal times and never eat outside of those meal times. Never take snacks outside of those meal times. All right, so gastrin produces the presence of proteins in the stomach. As soon as proteins go into the stomach, this causes the stomach to release a hormone called gastrin. Gastrin causes the stomach to produce HCl. As I said, caffeine will do the same thing, but gastrin is the natural way to do it. And then after the protein has been digested, your stomach produces a hormone called somatostatin. Statin refers to, the word statin comes from the word stationary. The word stationary means to stand still. Stationary means to stand still. So somatostatin causes, once the proteins are gone from the stomach, it turns the stomach off again. It stops the production of HCl. Right? So gastrin starts the production of HCl in response to protein in the stomach, and when the protein is all gone, your stomach is supposed to produce somatostatin that turns the production of HCl off. All right, so as I said, the word gastric or peptic both refer to the stomach, right? And so these two words refer to the stomach. A gastric ulcer or a peptic ulcer is where you lose some of the mucus that's protecting the stomach, and the stomach acid can actually burn your own stomach and cause something called an ulcer. An ulcer is a sore, basically. It's a fancy term for a sore. Now, in the old days, we used to tell people that they would suffer from ulcers if they had a stressful lifestyle. So you go to the doctor says you have multiple ulcers in your stomach, you need to take it easy, you need to take a vacation or something like that. Today we know that advice was completely wrong, that stomach ulcers are actually caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. And you can see the species name for this bacteria, pylori, refers to the pylorus of the stomach, because that's where you find it. Right? Escherichia coli, the other bacteria that I told you about, is found in the colon, and that's where it gets its name from. So Escherichia coli is a bacteria that you find in the colon. Helicobacter pylori is a bad bacteria that, Escherichia coli is a good bacteria most of the time that you find in the colon, Escherichia coli. But Helicobacter pylori is always a bad guy. Helicobacter pylori is sometimes found in the stomach because you got infected by it. And Helicobacter pylori actually eats and hydrolyzes mucus, and so it eats away the protective layer of mucus that protects your stomach and therefore causes ulcers. So in the old days, if you went to the doctor with ulcers, they would tell you to take a vacation. These days, if you go to the doctor with ulcers, they give you antibiotics that simply kill the Helicobacter pylori. Antibiotics, by the way, are drugs that kill bacteria and only bacteria. they're drugs that kill bacteria, but not viruses or other parasites. Okay, so Helicobacter pylori is the actual cause. It's a simple bacteria that can be killed by antibiotics, and it is the most common cause of stomach ulcers, of gastric ulcers or peptic ulcers. Okay, I already mentioned the fact that acid reflux is known as heartburn, and acid reflux is where the cardiac sphincter is not functioning properly, and it's allowing stomach juices to bubble up into the esophagus. And so, of course, if you put hydrochloric acid into your esophagus, that will hurt. All right, so now let's leave the stomach, and chyme, as it leaves the stomach, it enters the small intestine, and it continues to be broken down in the intestine. So the small intestine is divided into three parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And the passage from the stomach into the duodenum, which is where the food is first, is guarded by another sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. In the duodenum, the pH is raised all the way up from 2 all the way up to 8 by bicarbonate, which is added to the duodenum by the pancreas. The pancreas also produces other digestive enzymes that continue to work in the intestine. So as the food continues to travel through the small intestine due to peristalsis, the food is continually being digested. Okay, so proteins are being broken down into amino acids, polysaccharides are being broken down into monosaccharides, and lipids are being broken down into fatty acids. Those are the building blocks that we need in order to build our own tissues. We need those amino acids to make our own proteins, and to make our own, we need those fatty acids to make our own lipids, and so on. So how are these monomers that resulted from breaking down the food that we've eaten, how do they get into the bloodstream? Well, the intestines are lined on the outside with a network of veins that are collectively referred to as the hepatic portal system. All these veins that are coating the outside, attached to the outside of the intestines, are collectively called the hepatic portal system. Okay, the word hepato, as I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, the word hepato refers to the liver. Right? So portal, you know what a portal is. A portal is an entry into something, right? So you know what a computer portal is. A portal is a fancy word for an entrance, right? So the hepatic portal system, as the name implies, means that all of these nutrients, the amino acids and the monosaccharides and the fatty acids that have been broken down in the intestine, they are absorbed in the walls of the small intestine, where they enter into the hepatic portal system. The hepatic portal veins then come together into one large vein, which is called the hepatic portal vein, where they enter the liver. Okay, so all food, all of the amino acids, monosaccharides, and fatty acids that we get from our food do not enter the bloodstream directly. The first thing they do is they go through the liver, where they are filtered, where poisons, various types of poisons and waste products, are filtered out by the liver. So the liver, in addition to making bile salts, also is responsible for filtering the bad stuff out of the food that we've eaten. Okay, so the liver, there's another important job that the liver does. It gets very little credit for doing all this hard work, but that's the way life is sometimes. Okay, so here we have the stomach with the cardiac sphincter and the pyloric sphincter. All right, so you can see how it fits in with the alimentary canal. All right, so the pancreas produces it produces digestive enzymes as well as bicarbonate. Those substances are delivered to the duodenum through a duct. Now the word duct means a small tube, right? That is the meaning of a duct, a small tube. Right, so the pancreatic duct leads from the pancreas to the duodenum, and it delivers bicarbonate and various other pancreatic enzymes into the duodenum, which continue to digest the food. For example, there are pancreatic amylases that continue to digest the starch as the food goes through. There are pancreatic proteases and so on. Okay, so the pancreas is located behind the stomach. So in this diagram, the stomach is located here, but it's transparent, and we see where the pancreas is kind of located. So the liver is here, right? The stomach is over here, and then the pancreas is located sort of below and behind on the posterior side of the stomach. So you can't actually see the pancreas unless you remove the stomach or you lift the stomach out of place. Okay, the liver produces bile, the green stuff. The bile is stored temporarily in the gallbladder, and it is only sent to the duodenum when it's needed. You can actually live without a gallbladder, because what happens is if you remove the gallbladder, sometimes people have gallstones or something like that that do a lot of damage to the gallbladder. And if they do, it is possible to live without the gallbladder. What happens is it just means that bile is being sent continuously in small amounts to the duodenum, rather than sending a large amount of bile salt to the duodenum when it's needed. Okay, so the purpose of the bile, which is commonly called bile salts because it contains ions and things. So the bile, or the bile salts, its purpose is to emulsify fats, break it down into little droplets, which makes it easier for the lipase enzymes to digest it. Right, so the duodenum adds digestive enzymes and bicarbonate to the duodenum. Meanwhile, the gallbladder delivers bile salts, or bile, to the duodenum as well. Okay, so everything enters the small intestine. So here's the stomach up here, and then here's the duodenum. Duodenum goes behind the large intestine, and then we have the first part of the large intestine, which is the jejunum, and then the second part of the small intestine is the duodenum, and then the duodenum meets the cecum, and then the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and then the descending colon, and the sphygmoid colon. Okay, so the food that is digested in the small intestine is absorbed by the hepatic portal system, which is a network of veins that takes these nutrients to the liver. The hepatic portal veins all converge, they all join together into one large vein that's located just below the liver, and it is referred to as the hepatic portal vein. And the food that that we've eaten, these nutrients that we've absorbed, they have to be detoxified in the liver before they can be added to the general blood supply. And then also, as the food passes through the liver, a lot of the glucose is converted into glycogen for storage by the liver. But generally, the liver's main function is to filter out a lot of the poisons from the food that we've eaten. Breakdown of the food often creates bad waste products like ammonia and peroxide, hydrogen peroxide. So two of the main poisons that the liver filter out of the food that we eat are ammonia and hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so there are some people who eat the liver. You can eat I mean, I happen to like the taste of liver, but it's not a good idea to eat the liver because it's a filter that's filled up with all of this bad stuff. So it's filled up with another compound called urea, which is found in urine. Has a sour taste. So the liver is filled, eating the liver is not advisable. Some people do, but it's not advisable. Okay, so here we see the inside of the intestines, and you can see the inside of the intestines is lined with columnar epithelial cells that are organized into little finger-like structures called villi. The purpose of those villi is simply to increase the surface area of the small intestine, because the more surface area that you have in the small intestine, the more food you can absorb. And so the body uses various tricks to increase the surface area of certain spots. And one of the spots where the body uses this trick is inside the small intestine. So the small intestine is organized into villi in order to increase the surface area so that we can absorb more food. Okay, and then surrounding the outside of the small intestine, we have the hepatic portal system, all of these veins that absorb the nutrients. Those veins eventually converge into one large vein called the hepatic portal vein, where the food enters the liver, where it's detoxified, and then after the food is all detoxified, it's sent into the regular bloodstream by another vein called the hepatic vein. So be very careful. Do not confuse the hepatic portal vein, which leads from the small intestine to the liver. Do not confuse that with the hepatic vein, which leads from the liver into the general blood supply. Right? They sound almost the same, but the hepatic portal vein is different than the hepatic vein. And I will probably try to trick you about that later in the course. I will ask you, what do you call the vein that leads from the liver to the general blood supply? A, the hepatic portal vein, B, the hepatic vein, and so on. I'll probably try to trick you about that. All right, now what about the large intestine, which is also known as the colon? One of the functions of the colon is to recover water. So in order to digest the food, in order to hydrolyze food, we had to add a lot of water to it, didn't we? That's the meaning of hydrolysis. Okay, now if we just let all that food mix with the water and then let it go out in that form, we would lose a lot of water every time we excrete the undigested food. In fact, if you've ever had diarrhea, what comes out is actually what the food looks like while it's still in the small intestine. It's very runny. It's a very thin liquid. It's a brown liquid. So the job of the colon, the large intestine, is to reabsorb a lot of that water that we put in there and reclaim it, so that you know that when excrement comes out, if you have diarrhea, it comes out as a very thin brown liquid, runny brown liquid. But normally it's a semi-solid, right? It's a soft, like putty or something, and that's because the colon has reabsorbed most of the water back out, so that we don't have to be drinking all the time, because otherwise we would become dehydrated very fast. Okay, so the function of the colon is to reabsorb and reclaim the water that we added to the food in order to hydrolyze it. And also the colon contains all of these symbiotic Escherichia coli and other bacteria that again eat some of the food and provide us with vitamin K. Now, interestingly, you know that excrement smells bad, right? It smells very bad. That smell that you're smelling is actually the smell of the E. coli. That's the Escherichia coli bacteria that makes that smell. So you may have noticed this, or if you haven't had the opportunity to notice this yet, maybe you'll notice it in the future, which is that when a baby is newly born, when a baby is a newborn baby, their excrement does not smell bad. It doesn't have any smell at all. And the reason for that is because they have not yet gotten the symbiotic bacteria into their intestine. How does the E. coli get in the intestine? We are not born with it, and that's why a newborn baby's excrement does not smell. But you'll notice that after the baby starts eating baby food, the excrement starts to smell, and that's because where do these E. coli, the Escherichia coli that get into our intestine, come from? From food. Right, so food is contaminated, no matter what you do, is usually contaminated with small amounts of bacteria. So the bacteria get into your alimentary canal when you eat the food, and many of them just stay in the intestine. Right, so many of them stay in the colon. All right, as I said, the colon is divided into ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon. I may ask you I probably will ask you actually on a test to explain what those are. Okay, so here we have the cecum, which is the spot where the small intestine, the ileum, joins the large intestine, the colon. So this is the cecum, a specialized part of the large intestine. Then we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum, which is the last stop for the food before it leaves through the structure called the anus. Okay, so there's the entire alimentary canal. Now see if you can identify these parts. You can stop the video if you want. Okay, so A is actually a salivary gland, but I would also accept the oral cavity. Right? But that's what it is. It's a salivary gland. B is the esophagus. C is the stomach, D is the liver, E is the gallbladder, which is kind of the green thing hiding behind the liver. F is the duodenum, it's pointing to the duodenum, the first part. Right? And then G is the jejunum, H is the ileum, and I is the large intestine. It's that arrow is specifically pointing at the ascending colon. All right, let's talk about, we've talked about how we eat. Let's talk about what needs to be eaten. What do we need to eat? As I said, there are 20 amino acids and we need lots of all of them, but there are 8 of them that we can no longer make for ourselves, and there are 2 that we continue to make, but we just don't make as many as we need. Right? So the process of creating 2 of those amino acids has been slowed down due to mutations of the enzymes that catalyze the reactions that make those amino acids. So in total, there are 10 essential amino acids. There are 10 amino acids that we can make and 10 that we either don't make or don't make enough of. We have essential fatty acids that we must get in our diet, including certain essential omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And you now know what the omega nomenclature system is. It's referring to counting backwards from the omega carbon, the last carbon. You count backwards until you run into the first double bond. And if you count 3 before you encounter a double bond, that's an omega-3 fatty acid. If you count 6, that would be an omega-6 fatty acid. Okay, now as I mentioned, the vitamins are used as cofactors by some of the various enzymes in the body. Some of those vitamins are soluble in water and some of them are not. In other words, some of the vitamins are hydrophilic and some of them are hydrophobic. The vitamins that are hydrophilic include the B vitamins as well as vitamin C, and I'll tell you what each of those is useful for in a minute. Those that are hydrophobic do not like to be in the water. They like to hide in the fats away from the water. They like to hide in the body's lipids away from the water. And those include vitamins A, D, E, K. So I could ask you on a test, name 2 fat-soluble vitamins. Name 2 vitamins that are hydrophobic, for instance, or 3 vitamins, right? Or of these vitamins, is vitamin K hydrophobic or hydrophilic? And then finally, minerals are sometimes used as cofactors for enzymes. So a cofactor is an extra piece of an enzyme that is not made of amino acids, but nevertheless it's an extra piece of the enzyme. If you go on more advanced biology courses, you'll learn that those things are called prosthetic groups. So the vitamins and minerals usually they do their jobs as prosthetic groups for enzymes. Okay, so minerals are things that you dig out of the ground. Right? So you dig calcium out of the ground, you dig iron out of the ground, and magnesium. So you do need a certain amount of calcium, iron, magnesium, manganese, a few of the minerals that are used as cofactors for enzymes as well. Okay, let's have a look at the water-soluble vitamins. I said all of the B vitamins are water-soluble. So sometimes you go to the drugstore, you see on the shelf they have a bottle that says B complex vitamins. That usually includes most of the essential B vitamins, and there are several of them. Each of the B vitamins, they have a number, B9, B10, B12, and so on. They also have a name. Right, so vitamin B9 is one of the most important essential vitamins that is used to build lipids, and the technical name for vitamin B9 is folic acid. Right, so I could ask you that on a test. I could say what is the proper name for vitamin B9, or I could say what is the B number that folic acid has, and it is critical because it's used for making lipid membranes, including the membranes that surround the axon of a neuron. And so it's critical for pregnant women to have the correct amount of vitamin B9. It's critical for pregnant women to have the proper amount of folic acid in their blood during pregnancy. If you have too little, the baby, having too little or too much folic acid in your diet when you're pregnant could cause the baby to have what is called neural tube defects, which are defects or problems with the development of the spinal cord. So there are various problems that you can have. Also, there are some other mental retardation issues that you can have if you have too much. If a pregnant woman should get the amount of get her blood tested regularly to see how much folic acid is in the blood. Generally, if you're pregnant when you're young, in your 20s, it's not a problem. But if you get pregnant as you're older, in your 30s or 40s, it becomes a bigger problem having the right amount of folic acid in the blood. If there's too little folic acid in the blood, you could have some problems with the development of the spinal cord. Spina bifida, for instance, is a disease of the spinal cord, the base of the spinal cord. And if a pregnant woman has too much folic acid in her blood, that could cause Down syndrome, which is characterized by mental retardation, small status, being short, and so on. A pregnant woman, especially a pregnant woman who's older, 30s to 40s, should check the amount of folic acid that's in her blood regularly. All right, vitamin C, the proper name is ascorbic acid, and if you have too little, it causes an old disease called scurvy, which causes bleeding of the skin, blistering, loss of hair, loss of teeth. In fact, what happens is that vitamin C is a critical cofactor for the enzymes that make connective tissue, the enzymes that catalyze the reactions that make connective tissue, including cartilage. And so cartilage is the connective tissue that holds a lot of things together. There's a lot of cartilage in the teeth that hold in the tissue that holds the teeth in your head, which is why if you don't get enough vitamin C, one of the symptoms of scurvy is teeth fall out. Now, scurvy is caused by not having enough vitamin C in your diet. So there are a number of reasons why you might have a really poor diet. We're starting to see, so where do you get vitamin C? Where do you get ascorbic acid? Well, let's look at the history of that. You probably know who this guy on the left is. You may or may not. That's Captain James Cook, who was a famous British explorer in the 18th century. So he was 1790, around that period. He noticed that sailors that went to sea for years at a time would take all kinds of disgusting food that would not spoil. Two of the foods they ate all the time was they drank mostly beer because the water would go stale, but beer was a pre-fermented, so it's already fermented, so it can't spoil. And they would bring salt pork. So they would bring pork in barrels that are filled with salt. The salt essentially prevented the bacteria from growing on the pork and spoiling it. And that's what they would eat mostly. And they would eat biscuits, which are just bread. And sailors would if they ate nothing but beer, salt pork, and biscuits, they would frequently get scurvy. So Captain James Cook was the first one to notice that when he visited one of these tropical islands, they filled up their ship with limes and lemons and oranges. And he found out that if you started eating limes, lemons, and oranges, the citrus fruits, which are rich in vitamin C, they didn't know what vitamin C was in those days, but those fruits happened to be rich in vitamin C, and if you sucked on those fruits while you were at sea, you would not get scurvy. So James Cook was the first person to invent the idea of sailors taking limes along on the sea journeys and sucking on these limes all the way through their voyage. And that is where the English got the derogatory term limeys from, because the other countries saw that the English sailors were sucking on limes, and so they called them limeys. Okay, so that's where that derogatory term came from, but that's the history of it, which is that to avoid scurvy, one of the ways to avoid scurvy is to eat lots of citrus fruits. Alternatively, these days you simply go to the drugstore or the pharmacist and you buy vitamin C supplements. So you should have some vitamin C, ample amounts of vitamin C in your diet to avoid scurvy. Let's look at the fat-soluble vitamins, the water-insoluble vitamins. Okay, so one of them is called vitamin A, which is known as retinol. Now, what do you call the back part of the eye where the image is formed? It's called the retina. And so if you do not get enough vitamin A in your diet, there will be problems with the formation of the retina in your eyes, and you'll get something called night blindness, which is the inability to see very well in the dark. Okay, so that's one example of a fat-soluble vitamin. Another example of a fat-soluble vitamin is vitamin D. I mentioned vitamin D when we discussed the bone system, the skeletal system, because vitamin D is necessary in order to absorb calcium in the intestine. So calcium is needed to build bones, and you can eat calcium in your diet, but the calcium will not be absorbed into your blood unless you have a sufficient amount of vitamin D. So if you have an insufficient amount of vitamin D, you can get a disease called rickets, which is a developmental disease where children growing up without enough vitamin D in their diet their bones will not develop properly, and they get a kind of a painful disease called rickets. Okay, so vitamin D is necessary to absorb calcium in the large intestine. Now, where does vitamin D normally come from? Vitamin D is produced in the skin in response to sunlight. Okay, here's an interesting fact for you. I mentioned the fact that going out into the sun is good for you because the sunlight reacts with your skin and produces vitamin D. However, it's a trade-off, because if you get too much sun, you could get skin cancer. Right. Now, human beings evolved, we believe, human beings evolved in Central Africa. The central part of Africa, which gets a lot of sunlight. So we're on one side of the risk factors. The risk is not at getting an insufficient amount of sunlight. The risk in Central Africa is getting skin cancer from too much sunlight. The same thing is true for the rest of the tropics. The tropical areas of the earth get lots of sunlight. And so when humans first evolved, getting enough sun was not an issue. The danger of getting skin cancer was an issue. And so humans evolved to have dark skin, dark pigment. The dark pigment is caused by a pigment. The word pigment means coloration, a chemical that has a color. Okay, so the brown pigment in human skin is caused by a pigment called melanin. And so humans originally evolved in the tropics, and we had dark skin. Some humans broke away and wandered north, and where there's less sunlight. And so the issue became not so much the fear of skin cancer, but the problem with not getting enough sunlight on the skin. And what happens is that melanin, the brown pigment, actually interferes with sunlight being absorbed in the skin, which means that if you have darker skin tone in a northern region like Canada, for instance, you have trouble. The melanin in your skin prevents you from absorbing enough sunlight to make sufficient amount of vitamin D. So if you live in Canada and you have dark skin, you should take more vitamin D. Somebody with light skin doesn't have to worry about that, because as it happens, light skin is better at absorbing the vitamin D because the melanin is not there. But if you live in the tropics and you have fair skin, then you have another problem, which is that, you're getting way too much sunlight, and you have a much stronger chance of getting skin cancer than somebody who has dark skin. So if you have dark skin and you live in a northern latitude like Canada, you should take lots of vitamin D. If you have fair skin and you live in a tropical climate, you should wear sunscreen all the time. You have to wear suntan lotion or sunscreen to prevent your skin from getting burned and risking skin cancer. Right? So sunlight is a double-edged sword when it comes to creating vitamin D. The purpose of the sun is meant to react with the skin and create vitamin D so that we can absorb calcium in our diet, but you have to be careful of where you're living on Earth, whether you get a lot of sunlight or too little sunlight. That will determine, and also where you live on the Earth and what skin tone you have is going to determine how much vitamin D you should take versus how much sunscreen you should wear. All right, minerals, calcium, again, same thing. Rickets is a bone disease, and rickets can be caused by one of two things. Rickets can be caused by a lack of calcium or a lack of vitamin D, because it's the vitamin D that allows you to absorb the calcium. All right, iron is a mineral. If you do not get enough iron in your diet, you would have problems with the hemoglobin in your blood. In fact, when we talk about the circulatory system, we might have a chance to talk about the different forms of anemia, which are lack of red blood cells. Lack of red blood cells, one of the ways that you can have lack of red blood cells is if your body doesn't produce enough hemoglobin to put into those cells. Your body will cut back on the amount of cells that it produces, and the amount of hemoglobin that you produce will be determined by the amount of iron that you have, because iron is used by hemoglobin as a cofactor. It's actually an iron ion that carries the oxygen by hemoglobin, right? So if you don't have enough iron, you can't make enough hemoglobin. If you don't make enough hemoglobin, your body says, why should I bother making all these red blood cells? And if you have blood that contains fewer than the normal number of normal concentration of red blood cells, you are anemic. That's called anemia. All right, potassium is a metal. It's a mineral that you dig out. It's not a metal. I apologize. It's a mineral. So metals are minerals, but not all minerals are metals. Okay, so potassium is a mineral as well. If you don't have the proper amount of potassium, you could have cardiac dysrhythmia. Cardiac refers to the heart. Dysrhythmia means an irregular heartbeat, right? So if you do not have enough potassium in your diet, you may have an irregular heartbeat, which could cause cardiac problems. Okay, now sodium. Sodium, if you mix sodium and chloride together, you get salt. It is possible for us to have too little salt, which causes problems, but the main problem that modern people have is way too much salt. Salt makes food taste better, and so everywhere that you go on Earth where they prepare food, they generally put way too much salt in it. Having too much salt leads to high blood pressure because you know, if you have salt in your bloodstream, water will absorb into the blood. That will cause, due to osmosis, that will cause the volume of blood to increase, and that causes the blood pressure to increase. Right. So generally the problem with sodium chloride in the modern world is that there's way too much of it in our food, which leads to an epidemic of high blood pressure. So one of the main problems that people have these days is high blood pressure. And a lot of that high blood pressure is caused by having too much salt in the food we eat. All right, let's just briefly talk about variations in the digestive system and what determines whether you're going to be a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore. So we're talking about mammals here. These are all, what types of variations of the human digestive system do other mammals have? All right, so a carnivore is an animal that eats meat, and it will kill other animals to eat. It generally does not eat animals that are already dead. Why would you, right? Humans don't eat stale meat if they can avoid it. We prefer fresh meat, right? And there's, you know, if you find a dead animal, you would generally avoid eating that because you don't know what killed it. Did it die of a disease? You know, so there are various reasons why a good carnivore would never eat an animal that was already dead, right? So carnivores are specialized to actually kill what they eat right away and eat it right away. An herbivore eats plants. Okay, now generally the herbivores, depending on which plants they eat, they may or may not have another organ that's called a rumen. Okay, so a rumen is another stomach that contains symbiotic bacteria that produce enzymes that can break down cellulose. Right? So plant tissue uses cellulose as a structural support. Very few organisms on Earth have enzymes that can hydrolyze cellulose, which is a polymer of beta-glucose. The only organisms that can do this are generally fungi, certain types of fungi, and certain types of fungus, and certain types of yeast, and certain types of bacteria. And so a ruminant animal, a ruminant, is an animal that has at least two stomachs. One of the stomachs is a regular stomach that produces pepsin and digests proteins. The other stomach is a stomach that is filled with symbiotic fungus and yeast and bacteria that produce cellulase enzymes that can break down cellulose and convert it into glucose. And so we call animals that have a rumen, we call them ruminant animals. Right? So cows are ruminants, deer are ruminants, and so on. Rabbits are ruminants. All right, here we have some typical carnivores on the left. Notice that they have gigantic cuspids. They have gigantic canine teeth, right? So we learned when we talked about the skull, when we talked about the teeth in the skull, when we discussed the skeletal system, we discussed the fact that incisors are the flat teeth at the front of the mouth that are used to bite food off. Canines are the fangs that are used for killing. Then the molars are the flat teeth at the back of the mouth that are used for grinding. And then the premolars are usually sort of a cross between the cuspids and the molars. Okay, so on the left we have some typical carnivores that have enormous canine teeth, enormous cuspid teeth. For the purpose of those is for killing. And then we have a typical herbivore on the right who generally does not have canine teeth. They just have very well developed flat molars for grinding the food up. Now there's some other characteristics that distinguish a carnivore from an herbivore. And one of the functional relationships between carnivores and herbivores is that carnivores eat herbivores, don't they? It never happens the other way around, right? So herbivores don't eat carnivores, carnivores eat herbivores. In fact, carnivores hunt herbivores and they chase them down and they kill them and eat them, right? Now, because of that, there are two characteristics that distinguish carnivore, three characteristics that distinguish carnivores from herbivores. First of all, notice that in the carnivores, the eyes are pointing forward. The eyes are located in the front of the head because these are hunters, and so they have the eyes in the front of the head so they can basically target their prey. The prey animal, the herbivore, has the eyes at the side of the head so that they can look out and be on the watch for carnivores chasing after them or jumping out of the bushes and chasing after them. So generally, carnivores have the eyes in the front of the head. Herbivores, which are the prey of carnivores, herbivores have the eyes on the sides of the head. Okay, now look at the ears on the carnivore versus the herbivore. On the carnivore, the ears are facing forward. If you look at your cat or your dog, you see that the ears face forward. So again, that's for targeting. They don't care what's going on around them. They're looking and listening at their prey. Right. On the other hand, the herbivore, the prey animal, has huge, big ears that are facing to the side because they're trying to hear as much as they can, so that if they fail to see the carnivore coming at them out of the bushes, they can at least hear it and they can run away very fast, right? So both herbivores and carnivores tend to be very fast for two different reasons. The carnivores are fast because they're chasing the prey are fast because they're running away from the carnivores. Okay, the third main difference is the canine teeth, right? So the carnivores have canine teeth because that's what they use to, they have enlarged canine teeth because that's what they use to kill the prey animal. The prey animal generally has no canine teeth because if you're not going to eat meat, if you don't have to kill your food, those big canine teeth simply get in the way of chewing. Okay, an omnivore eats both plants and other animals. It will usually eat animals that are already dead. Generally, omnivores have characteristics that are in between a carnivore and an herbivore. They have characteristics that look like a carnivore, but they just happen to be not very good at being a carnivore. And if they have to compete in an environment with better carnivores, they have no choice but to eat meat that's already dead because they can't compete for chasing the food the way the full-time professional carnivores can. Okay, a good example of an omnivore is a pig. You can see that a pig, if you look in a pig's mouth, it does have canine teeth, but they're not as big. And it has claws, but they're developed into hooves instead. It has big ears like an herbivore, and the eyes are set forward, but they are kind of to the side. So it has characteristics. A pig has characteristics of a carnivore, but just not a very efficient carnivore. What are humans, by the way? Well, think about that. Okay, what about detritivore? Detritivores are things like worms and insects that eat decomposing vegetable matter that you would find on the floor of a forest, the forest floor. So if you're a biologist, you call the part of the forest where the leaves are up at the top, you call that the forest canopy. Some of those leaves die and they fall onto the ground. The ground level of a forest is referred to as the forest floor, right? So the forest canopy versus the forest floor. So on the forest floor, you will always find decomposing leaves, and the organisms that eat that rotting vegetable matter are called detritivores. And so dead rotting leaf material is called detritus. And so the animals that eat it are called detritivores. So notice that we have these parts of words. The word vor means what you eat. So carnivores, the word carne is a Latin word for flesh. Right? Now, I told you at the beginning of the course that Latin, the Spanish language, for instance, is a descendant of the Roman language of Latin. Right? So if you have the words in Spanish, if you can speak Spanish, you can probably understand Latin. And if you spoke Spanish to an ancient Roman, they would probably understand you most of the time. They would understand what some of the words mean. Okay, so what is chili con carne in Spanish? Chili con carne means chili with meat. Chili con carne, chili with meat. So the word carne is a derivative of a Latin word meaning flesh. Herb is a derivative meaning a plant. Omni means everything, so an omnivore eats everything. And detritus means garbage, basically, detritus. Okay, so here we have some detritivores, examples of detritivores. So I could ask you about all of this stuff on the test. Which are humans? Right? What do you think? Humans, of course, are omnivores unless they have some philosophical reason not to eat flesh, generally, right? And we do, humans can't eat raw meat, which would disqualify us from being professional carnivores. So like if humans eat raw meat, they would get a stomach ache because the pepsin in the stomach would have a hard time breaking all of that protein down. So humans don't eat raw meat, and we're not very good at catching prey animals and killing them. We do have canine teeth, but we're not really very good carnivores. So humans are generally omnivores. Okay, so a carnivore is a predatory hunter. It tends to be very fast and strong. It has very sharp claws, and it has enlarged canine teeth, and the ears and the eyes are facing forward. Okay, so here we have the skull of a carnivore, right? So you can see it has good incisors. It has reduced or absent molars in the background. So one of the characteristics of a carnivore are that the eyes and the ears face forward. It has enlarged canine teeth and reduced or absent molar teeth, right? So those are if I asked you what are the characteristics of a carnivore, you can say those things. Herbivores, they are the prey. They are hunted by carnivores. They tend to be fast, but instead of having paws with claws, they have hooves, which allow them to run faster. They have reduced or absent canine teeth, and they have enlarged rough molars with a rough surface for grinding up leaves and grass and so on. The eyes and the ears face forward, and some types of these animals have a rumen stomach, and therefore they are ruminants. They can chew up leaves, and the symbiotic microorganisms in the rumen can break down the cellulose for them. Okay, so here we have a typical skull of a prey animal. Notice that the canine teeth are reduced or absent altogether, but the molar teeth are very large and very rough on the surface and very good for grinding up vegetation like leaves. So here we have a goat. You can see that there's a regular stomach and then there's a rumen stomach. Right? So the rumen stomach contains symbiotic bacteria and yeast and fungi that can break down cellulose. Literally what happens is the goat eats cellulose. The cellulose goes down into the rumen, and then the goat will actually vomit up the material little by little and then swallow it again where it goes into the regular stomach. So when you're chewing slowly, that is called ruminating. Right? So you might have heard the term ruminating. They use that word metaphorically to describe somebody who's thinking, because I'm ruminating on that problem. That means I'm sitting here chewing and thinking about it. Right, so ruminating is a metaphor that's used to describe thinking for a human, but ruminating really means chewing on your cud. The cud is the food that's vomited back up from the rumen stomach. Okay, an omnivore features characteristics of both, but it's not mainly features of a carnivore, but it's just not a very good example of a carnivore. All right, I have something that's of interest to you if you live in British Columbia like we do. Okay, so on the left we have a brown bear, and on the right we have a black bear. Which one is bigger? Do you know? Okay, you can see the size of a black bear. If you live in various parts of British Columbia that are away from the city, usually, where you have bears, one of the problems that you'll have is that you have these black bears that are about approximately 2 meters. If they stand straight up on their hind legs, they might be 1.5 meters more likely. They are always rummaging through your garbage. Now, if they are tearing into your garbage can, it means that they must be omnivores. Right? So they're not carnivores. The brown bears are generally much larger. For example, the grizzly bears. The grizzly bears are enormous and powerful, and they are carnivores. Ironically, what they eat is not, they don't chase down other animals. They generally eat fish. They love to eat salmon during the salmon season. It's their favorite thing to eat. But they can kill and eat other animals if they have to. Okay, so we have a black bear. You can see on the right here, rummaging through garbage. The black bear is an omnivore, and the brown bear is a carnivore. Okay, look how big the carnivore is compared to the omnivore. Look how big the grizzly. This is a grizzly bear. This is obviously not a live grizzly bear, or that guy wouldn't be standing there. Certainly wouldn't be standing there like that. But you can see that just one of the paws of that grizzly bear is bigger than a human chest, right? So just one of the paws of a grizzly bear can span an entire human chest. So if you come up against one of those and it's determined to kill you, just forget it. There's nothing you can do. Uh, um, you know, there's really nothing you can do. All right, so you know this saying. What do you do if you're in British Columbia? What do you do in a bear? You're walking down a nice peaceful trail in the forest, and you turn a corner and there's a bear there. What do you do in order to avoid getting killed by this bear? Right? So you say, the common thing is you say, oh, you play dead. Play dead, meaning that you fall on the ground, you lock your fingers behind your neck, you curl up into a fetal position, and you pretend like you're dead. And the bear will poke around with its nose and push you around with its paws, and then it will determine that you're dead, and then it'll leave you alone and go away. Okay, now that is only true if the bear is a carnivore, because only carnivores will not eat meat that's already dead. Right? So in order to play dead, you have to know whether the bear that you're facing is a brown bear, a grizzly bear, or a black bear. If you're confronted by a brown bear, you can play dead and maybe you'll survive. You know, maybe the grizzly bear that likes to eat only fresh meat will sniff around and think, well, I'm not going to eat. I don't know how long this has been dead, so I won't eat it. So it may spare you and go away. But if it's a black bear and you play dead, it will say, oh, excellent, free food, free dinner. So you have to know whether it's a brown bear, a grizzly bear, or a black bear as to whether or not you're supposed to play dead. So with a grizzly bear, theoretically, you're supposed to play dead if you have no other choice. You're not supposed to run away from a grizzly bear because that encourages them to chase you, right? So running away from a grizzly bear is a very bad thing to do. With a black bear, you shouldn't run away from a black bear either. But for a black bear, the only thing you can do is make a lot of noise. You shout and wave your hands and make a lot of noise and hope that it's scared of you. You make yourself look big and make a lot of noise and hope that it's scared of you. They do sell, if you go hiking, and there's a possibility, if you're hiking in a remote part of British Columbia and there's a possibility of this happening, you should bring along something called bear spray. Bear spray is basically it's a can the size of a fire extinguisher that sprays pepper spray at the bear. So if you have, and they also have bear firecrackers. And so if some of you may actually do this for a living, but when I was a biology student, you know, we would go to school during the year, and then what do you do for a summer job? Most people have to have a job during the summer to make money when school is not in session. And so the biology students would do one of two things. They would either work at a fish farm, or they would work planting trees. They would replant the forest, because one of the big professions, one of the big industries in BC is forestry. Of course, we cut down trees and turn them into boards and sell the timber. That's one of the main industries of BC. Okay, so if somebody cuts down the trees, then if you want more trees, somebody has to replant them. And so the loggers who cut down the trees generally get paid a lot of money. I come from many generations of loggers. My grandfather and both my grandfathers and great-grandfathers were all in the logging industry. So loggers get paid a lot of money to cut down the trees, and then the forestry companies pay university students a little bit of money, fairly low wages, to replant the trees in the summer, but it's expected to be a temporary job. So that's one of the things that university students do during the summer. And biologists are interested in forests or fish, and so they work in a fish farm or they work as a tree planter. So a lot of my friends and some of my relatives would spend every summer replanting trees, and you're out in the area where you might run into bears, and so they would carry bear spray and firecrackers, where you set off this little firecracker and the bang will scare the bear away. If that doesn't work, you spray it in the face with the pepper spray. So those are things that you can take to protect yourself if you're out hiking through the forest. Okay, now here's a final thing that's kind of interesting. The cecum, which I mentioned is the part that joins the small intestine to the large intestine, the cecum tends to be very large in herbivores and very small in carnivores. Right, so here we have a carnivore on the left. This is a fox, and it has a very small cecum. And then over on the right, we have a koala bear, which is a marsupial found in Australia, and it has a very large cecum. So for reasons we don't quite understand, carnivores tend to have a small cecum and a small colon and a long small intestine, whereas herbivores have the opposite. They have a shorter small intestine, an enormous cecum, and then a very large colon. Right. If we were doing this course in the laboratory, we would have had some dissected animals for you to look at. In the laboratory, we have a dissected rabbit and a dissected cat. They've already been dissected and they're preserved, and you can look and you can see that in the rabbit the cecum is quite large, and it's much larger than it is in the cat. And then we have you dissect some rats in the laboratory. If we were doing this in person, we dissect some rats, and then you look at the rat intestine, and then you look at the teeth in the rat's mouth, and you look at the position of the rat's eyes, and then you tell us whether you think that rats were originally meant to be carnivores or herbivores. Rats, of course, are omnivores. They'll eat anything, literally each other included. But then you look at the features of the digestive system of the rats, and then your job is to tell us whether you think they were originally meant to be carnivores or herbivores, and then you have to explain the reasons why you think that. And so the size of the cecum, the length of the small intestine are reasons for that. Okay, so odontology is the study of teeth, and we've already discussed some of that. So incisors are for biting off pieces of food, canines are for killing, molars are for grinding. The teeth are covered with enamel, which is a very hard coating. In herbivores, the grinding surface of the molars is not covered with enamel, so that makes them even rougher, which is better for grinding up leaves. So here we have a carnivore on the top. Carnivore has enlarged canines, reduced or absent molars, and all of the teeth, including the molars, are completely covered with enamel. An herbivore, reduced or absent canines, enlarged molars that do not have an enamel crown. The crown is the top of the tooth. The crown of the molars in an herbivore is rough because there's no enamel, and you're just feeling the bone fragment underneath. Here, humans, we have little tiny cuspids, little tiny canines, molars, but our molars are not big and impressive like the herbivore, and furthermore, our molars are completely covered with enamel the way they are in a carnivore. So this leads us to believe that, and also the human eyes are facing forward, the human ears are not, depending on what your ears look like. But all of this together suggests that possibly humans were originally carnivores. They just simply became omnivores because they had to compete with better carnivores. Okay, to summarize what we talked about the components of the human digestive system, components of the alimentary canal plus the accessory organs, the liver and the pancreas. We talked about nutrition, that is what you have to eat, including amino acids, fatty acids, oils, and vitamins and minerals and so on. And we talked about the various animal digestive systems that distinguish carnivores from herbivores versus omnivores. And we learned the names and functions of all the teeth, which is a branch of a science called odontology. All right, don't forget this week's vocabulary words. Right, and then next week, I believe we have the respiratory system. So I'll see you for the respiratory system lecture.